because there's an astonishing tax break.
Next on Listening to America, Part 2 of America, What Went Wrong.
Tune in to Iowa Public Television Tuesday at 9.
This is Iowa Public Television.
Acquisition of this program was made possible by Friends of Iowa Public Television. And funding for the Iowa broadcast is provided by Luther College in Decorah, Iowa, since 1861, an environment for academic excellence. And by CRST, a family-owned company based in Iowa and a major truck carrier in the United States, which is proud to support the MacNeil Lehrer NewsHour.
Good evening. I'm Jim Lehrer in Washington.
And I'm Robert MacNeil in New York. After the news summary tonight, we examine the airfare revolution started by American Airlines and where it leads. We have a Tom Bearden report, and we're joined by American Chairman Robert Crandall with Carl Icahn of TWA and the former heads of Pan American and New York Air. Next, a report from the long-closed Soviet city of Gorky, now in the toils of economic reform. And we close with an Ann Taylor Fleming essay on modern first ladies.
Part of helping the world live and communicate better is keeping it well informed. That's why funding for the MacNeil Lehrer NewsHour is provided by AT&T and by PepsiCo. And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and viewers like you.
The Supreme Court agreed today to consider new limits on federal jurisdiction in criminal cases. It decided to review a Michigan case where a federal appeals court dismissed a murder conviction on grounds a state court had failed to uphold the suspect's Miranda rights. Miranda requires police to tell suspects they may remain silent and they have the right to an attorney. In California today, a federal appeals court lifted a stay of execution for convicted murderer Robert Alton Harris. He could be put to death as early as tomorrow. It would be the state's first execution in 25 years. Robin?
Activists on both sides of the abortion debate are gearing up for a confrontation in Buffalo, New York. An anti-abortion group called Operation Rescue has targeted that upstate New York community for continuous protests like those last summer in Wichita, Kansas. Starting tomorrow, they plan to surround and shut down clinics which perform abortions. Most of today's demonstrators were abortion rights advocates who have vowed to keep the clinics open. On Wednesday, the U.S. Supreme Court will hear a challenge to a new Pennsylvania law which sharply restricts abortions in that state.
The Supreme Court acted on 2 school desegregation cases today. It ordered a federal appeals court to restudy its ruling that the Topeka, Kansas school district had not done enough to get rid of segregation. The Supreme Court let stand rulings in Boston which require that minorities make up 35% of public school teachers and administrators. A teachers union had argued the plan exceeded the federal court's authority to desegregate the school system.
Thousands of United Auto Workers returned to work today at Caterpillar Tractor after a bitter 5-month strike. Union leaders called a halt to the Peoria walkout last week without a new contract. The two sides will join federal mediators in an effort to reach a settlement. Caterpillar backed off an earlier threat to lay off 15% of the 12,600 strikers. American Airlines announced it is cutting airfares today. The move came less than 2 weeks after American announced a simplified price structure that it said would reduce the cost of air travel for most passengers. We'll speak to American's chairman Robert Crandall and one of his chief competitors, Carl Icahn of TWA, after the news summary.
Rival rebel groups have surrounded Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan. They have demanded the surrender of what remains of the government. One radical Muslim group has threatened to attack if that doesn't happen within a week. We have a report from Kabul by Paul Davies of Independent Television News.
On a day when rainstorms turned the countryside around Kabul into a bog, creating moats around the capital's defensive forts, the reports from Jalalabad and Kandahar were just more depressing news for the capital's beleaguered garrison. Once the government forces, armed by their Soviet allies, were able to create an impregnable shield around Afghanistan's major cities, now the shield is crumbling, the soldiers are despondent. This officer told us he no longer knew what to believe. Kabul radio's telling us the situation in Jalalabad's normal, but the Mujahideen are saying they've captured it, he said. We just want peace now. At Kabul airport, many military planes appear to be grounded. We've been told fuel supplies, even for the military, are critically low. The Soviet Union used to supply the Najibullah regime's needs, but shipments stopped at the end of last year. It's no longer possible to say just who controls Kabul. There are rebels already in the capital. Some of these men belong to the Mujahideen leader Massoud's army. Others, travelling in the same armoured convoy, are followers of the militia general Dostum. Ironically, they are on their way to halt the advance of another Mujahideen leader, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. Effectively, they're siding with the remnants of the government army against the Islamic fundamentalist Hekmatyar. In Afghanistan, switching allegiances when it suits is the way of war. No one doubts now that the Mujahideen will take Kabul. The question is which faction will arrive here first, and whether they'll be looking to take the capital intact or to extract revenge for 14 years of bloody fighting.
Afghanistan's ousted President Najibullah was reported to be on his way to India. The Reuters news agency said Indian officials expected him to land in New Delhi late tonight.
The United States and the European community are considering breaking diplomatic relations with Yugoslavia. Reuters news agency quoted a State Department official as saying the action might be taken to protest Serbian attacks against the breakaway Republic of Bosnia. Serbian paramilitary forces took control of another border town in Bosnia-Herzegovina today. It was the fifth town to fall into Serbian hands in recent days. Thousands of residents have fled to the north to escape the fighting. The capital of Sarajevo remains mostly deserted. Small groups of Muslims patrol the city. Most are civilian volunteers. In Moscow today, Boris Yeltsin's free market reforms hit hard at the gas pump. A price increase of 400% went into effect throughout the city. It now costs about a week's salary, or 240 rubles, to fill up. The price rise comes after a massive demonstration in Moscow yesterday in support of Yeltsin's reforms. Communist protesters held a counter-march. Later in the program, we'll have a documentary report on the struggle with reform in the Russian city of Gorky.
President Bush was in Columbus, Ohio today to help honor a Columbus named Christopher. Mr. Bush opened an international flower show commemorating Columbus's first voyage to the Americas 500 years ago. He said Columbus's story continues to inspire Americans. Columbus's 1492 voyage was also marked in Seville, Spain today with the opening of Expo 92. Spain's King Juan Carlos and Queen Sofia presided over the ceremonies. 110 countries and 23 international organizations have exhibits at the World's Fair.
That's our news summary. Now it's on to the new airfare wars, economic reform in Gorky, and modern first ladies.
There are no price wars quite like airfare price wars. They are complex, ferocious, and all-consuming, meaning no one who runs an airline or flies on one goes untouched. The current one may be the most complex, most ferocious, and most all-consuming of all. It was started 12 days ago by American Airlines, the nation's largest carrier, with a whole new fare structure. We'll hear from two men who run airlines and two men who used to, right after this backgrounder by Tom Bearden.
When the country's biggest airline announced it was dramatically reducing prices and eliminating all but 4 basic fare classes, it was a direct assault on a structure both travel agents and passengers had come to know and hate.
It's frustrating for us as a travel agent because half of the phone calls we get are trying to explain to people how come they saw $198 in the paper, we're charging them $498, and then when they call us up, it went down to $398. And if anybody can figure that one out, it's pretty good.
American Airlines alone had 500,000 different fares before restructuring. The seats on each of the flights between 13,000 pairs of cities often had as many as 24 different prices. For most flights, American now has just 4 prices in its Sabre computer reservation system: first class, coach, 7-day advance purchase, and 21-day advance. As always, some restrictions apply to the cheapest tickets, but not nearly as many as before. What surprised many industry observers is that American cut unrestricted coach fares, the fares most business travelers use, by 38%.
Well, certainly your budget can go further, so it has to be viewed favorably. With regard to my own personal air travel, it certainly will make a difference in terms of the frequency in which we take vacations and what have you.
Reducing coach fares is a very big gamble for American. Most of any airline's profits come from those expensive seats. American concedes it's going to take a big revenue hit in the short term, but believes lower fares will generate a lot of new business traffic. Denver travel agent Steve Tobin hasn't seen much new business yet. He's been frantically rewriting tickets at the new fares and issuing refunds.
The lowest was about $30, and the highest was about $380 savings. So of our business for this week, it's been more than half of our business rewriting the tickets.
With prices dropping so dramatically, what happens to your commissions?
You got it. It's the 40% discount in fare, decreased fare means 40% less income for us. That's one of the things with rewriting all these tickets. None of the airlines were willing to protect our commission, so every refund we give, part of it's coming out of our pocket as well as the airlines. So that's a frustrating part for us. They say that it's going to make the phone rings that much more, but that hasn't happened yet here.
The new fares were supposed to make things less confusing for travel agents and passengers. But not all of the computer reservation systems that travel agents use to sell tickets, and they sell 80% of all tickets, accurately reflect the new structure yet.
Let's find out how many fares there are, say, between Dallas and Denver on American Airlines.
Tobin's agents use United Airlines' Apollo system, the second largest reservation computer. Apollo still shows 14 different fares on American's flights between Denver and Dallas, for example.
They're advertising that there's only 4 fares out there, but then we pull up and the fares between the two cities, and we get a lot more than that. So the public is saying, I understand there's only 4 fares. What's the problem here?
An American spokesman told us that computer tapes containing the correct information had been delivered to United. United says the fare displays came from American's tapes. Some analysts wonder if there isn't a more serious problem, whether the industry's efforts to stimulate new business aren't too late. They believe previously high fares have forced companies to find other ways to do business than travel.
They are going to be releasing the Seattle directory.
For example, U.S. West Corporation, a regional telephone operating company, invested in teleconferencing facilities to allow its employees to meet by video instead of face-to-face. In the first 2 months of this year, they saved $2.6 million in airfares.
We took a look at where air travel was going, not only where air travel was going, but the amount of travel we were using. And as we saw this increasing year over year, we felt we had to do something to curb this cost. Is that travel gone forever? Is it lost business that you simply will not do again? No, it's not gone forever, I'm sure, but we are taking a very good chunk away from it and watching the way we travel to make sure that it's only for purposes we really need, that this cannot accommodate.
Good afternoon. Despite the uncertainties, other airlines moved quickly to match Americans' fares. Financially troubled TWA, in Chapter 11 bankruptcy reorganization, said it would not only match, but undercut. Other carriers still have popular discount fares in effect, like group rates and special policies for family emergencies that American dropped. That leads some travel agents to question whether American can make the new structure stick, or be forced by competitive pressure in the coming months to again offer more than just 4 fares.
As we said in the news summary, today American fired another volley in the new fare wars, reducing many fares to match the new competitors' low prices. Joining us first is the head of one of those competitors. Carl ICAHN is chairman and CEO of Trans World Airlines. He joins us from his office in Mount Kisco, New York. Mr. ICAHN, you've said that TWA would not only match but undercut other carriers like American. What about the latest fares they've announced today?
Well, we're studying them right now, and we probably will be cutting some, but we are still a fair amount lower than Americans. For instance, from Dallas to New York. We fly Dallas to New York, and we'll be putting on more direct flights from Dallas to New York, and we will be pricing them about $323 round trip. American cut them to $600 round trip. We think we found a niche here, and we can do this because our costs are so much lower than Americans at this point, because we are leasing planes at lower rates. Our labor costs are lower. We've cleaned up a lot of our bureaucracy. We are restructuring our balance sheet. And we are here to stay. And we think we found a niche, and we're going to continue with it.
American says that its purpose is to simplify fares and to increase volume of travel. What do you see as their purpose?
Well, I mean, they're just obfuscating the real purpose here. The real purpose is to drive airlines out of the business. I mean, that's been Americans' modus operandi with Braniff, and it was when Pan Am went out of business. I mean, they just raised fares in the Caribbean, you know. But I'm not really criticizing them. I think that that's American business today. It's not a Boy Scout picnic, and American is doing what they think they have to do. I think that American themselves looking at their own problems, and I really do think that these big airlines have big problems. They have a tremendous cost overruns today. The big airlines have painted themselves into a box, into a corner where they have tremendous problems looking ahead. I think, you know, it's the accepted logic isn't always correct that, you know, the small airlines or the TWAs have all the problems.
They have problems as serious as yours. I mean, can they succeed in driving? Can they succeed in driving you out of business?
Well, they're not going to
succeed
succeed
if that
with
is their
us.
purpose.
You know, look, I can't speak for the other airlines, but they're not going to succeed with us. We're here. I'm an old veteran fighter in these type of wars, and we're here to stay, and we're going to stay. As I say, you know, it's very hard to drive a low-cost competitor out of business if he really wants to stay in it. And again, we're a low-cost competitor. The big airlines have 8% increases in costs every year. So if you're an American Airlines with $10 billion in costs, and it's going up $800 million a year, you don't have to be a mathematical genius to understand that you have to do something. And I think they're doing what they think they should do. They're taking a real shot here. If they succeed in driving everybody out of business, they'll win. If they don't, I think they have a lot of explaining and apologizing to do to their shareholders.
Well, thank you. We'll come back. We're joined now by two men who headed up now defunct airlines. Thomas Plaskett was the last man to run Pan American World Airways, which stopped flying last December. Prior to that, he worked at Continental and American Airlines. He's now a private consultant and joins us from Dallas. Michael Levine is the former CEO of New York Air, one of the many airlines that rose and fell since the deregulation of the industry. He's currently dean of the Yale University School of Organization and Management. Mr. Levine, is American trying to drive others out of business? Is that the purpose?
Well, it's hard to know what their purpose is. I think they have embarked on a course that it will stress financially distressed, particularly bankrupt airlines, at a time when they need the cash they would normally get from the second and third quarters of operation.
Which are those besides TWA?
Well, TWA, America West, and Continental are all in Chapter 11, which means they're operating under the bankruptcy laws and have suspended payment of their debts. American has criticized the fact that the bankruptcy laws allow carriers to do that. They've also said that there is only room for 3 or 4 carriers in the United States. I don't think we can speculate directly on Americans' intent, but they're very smart, analytically acute people, and they must understand that they're causing real financial distress for some of these weak competitors.
Well, will that force some of them out of business? Is Mr. ICAHN's confidence about TWA justified?
Well, American went into the turn of the year with about $1 billion in cash, and they raised $400 million more in equity markets, and they canceled orders for a fair amount of equipment that would have required cash. I would say American staying power is pretty impressive. I don't think
they have a cash cushion.
They have a cash cushion that will allow them to operate at these fares for quite some time. I'd be very surprised if Continental or TWA or America West could operate for anything like that.
The American plan seems to be very popular with consumers. It says its bookings are way up. Do you see it that way?
Well, I don't see why a consumer looking at the situation now would dislike it. Fares have come down. The system right now is relatively simple. It's getting more complex every day, but certainly the Americans move simplified things. I think the real question is whether as this accelerates the consolidation in the industry, whether this acceleration in pace will mean that at the end there's less competition than there would have been if the consolidation, which is inevitable anyway, had gone at a slower pace and allowed these assets to be rearranged more so that there are more viable competitors.
So you say there are going to be fewer airlines anyway. This is just pushing the pace fast, turning up the heat on the pace, is it?
Absolutely right. I think there will be fewer airlines. I think the most likely outcome before this move would have been that there would have been 5 or 6 airlines, and that would have been more than enough for very strong competition in this country. The real question here, and it's just hard to know the answer, is whether pushing the pace very fast will have the effect that I expect American expects it will have, of putting airlines on the ground and breaking up their assets in liquidation so they can't be used too easily by other carriers.
Mr. Plaskett in Dallas, what's your take on the American move?
Well, Robert, I think we've moved a little bit off the mark here. American's original fare restructuring is dramatic and bold, but the industry has gone through this kind of fare simplification several times in the past few years because the system, frankly, does get unwieldy. And as your initial report showed, it confuses travel agents, the public, and airlines alike. However, while advertising 38% fare reductions and 50% fare reductions makes great advertising copy, it has really clouded what I think was the principal motivation here, and that is to raise average fares. That it really isn't a fare reduction. That with the elimination of discounts and the fact that very little airline traffic actually moves at full fare rates, the objective here was and should have been to raise average fares and total revenues for an industry that is on its back and frankly must have higher average fares and higher revenues if it's going to be an effective competitor in the next decade.
Since that is such a paradoxical statement, could you just spell out in more detail how lowering the average economy class fare by 38% is actually a fare increase?
Well, in 1991, only about 5% of all airline traffic in the industry moved at full fare. The full fare benchmark fare is the price that was reduced in the area of 38 to 50%. So very little of airline traffic was already moving at the higher full fares. On the other hand, it represented a higher percentage than that of airline revenues. That means that business travelers were taking advantage of discounts. And in fact, the average discount in 1991 was 67% off full fare. Now, if those discounts go away and the new discounts don't represent percentage decreases that large, then the average has to be an increase in average prices.
You've heard what the others have said. What will be the effect on some of the airlines that are in trouble now? To drive some out of business?
Well, we need to recall that the original structure that was put in the industry and was announced has now been changed, and prices have now gone down more dramatically. So there will be additional financial stress on carriers that do not have the resources to live through the cycle. And it confirms my long-held view that the ultimate winner of the airline battlefield is the one that runs out of cash last.
And who is that most likely to be?
Well, there are still a few around that have some cash, but certainly if this particular activity isn't strengthened and stabilized, it's going to result in some rather substantial cash losses.
Yeah. Thank you. Now to the man who started all the recent fuss, Robert Crandall, the chairman and CEO of American Airlines. He joins us also from Dallas. Let's go through these points, Mr. Crandall. First, you just heard Mr. Plaskett say what you're really doing, and he said the industry needed it, is raising fares.
Well,
you heard his explanation.
I did. I think it's very important to sort of recall what's actually happening here. We had lots of frustration among our customers, lots of customers writing to us saying, look, these fares, this very complicated fare structure denies me the flexibility I need, is chaotic, is unfair. I get on the airplane, I've tried to get a good fare. The person sitting next to me is paying half that fare. and saying to us, in addition, because the fare structure is so chaotic, so unfair, so inflexible, I'm just going to stay home. So as we looked at the numbers over the last several years, and we noted that business travel has declined or has increased very, very modestly, while leisure travel has increased quite substantially. Clearly, the old fare structure was discouraging business travel. So what we did is we simply said to ourselves, look, our customers aren't getting a good value. They're writing us, they're telling us they're not getting a good value. And we therefore put in place this very simple fare structure that you've heard described. Now, the fact is we have cut the basic economy fare by 38%. We've cut first-class fares 20 to 50%. We've put in place 2 very deeply discounted fares. The result is not going to be to raise fares. In terms of airline economics, we expect that yields will remain about constant. That is, that the average price paid per mile will remain about the same. What we hope for and think we will realize is a very substantial increase in the volume of travel, which will mean a bigger pie for all airlines to divide. So we think we've got something here that's good for consumers and good for airlines and good for the economy. And, we think it's a good plan, and we hope it's going to work.
Mr. ICAHN says and he said it before, your real intention is to drive him and other airlines in trouble out of business. And today you've announced even more cuts in many domestic fares and reduced your 21-day excursion fare to 14 days.
Well, that's exactly right.
Aren't you playing really hard ball with these other airlines?
No, I don't think so. 2 or 3 points I think are important. In the first place, the airline marketplace is the closest thing to a perfect marketplace that any consumer can find. One telephone call to one travel agent, that customer knows exactly who's selling what service at what price everywhere in the world. Everyone knows, and we have said from the outset, that we have to be competitive in terms of the actual level of fares. What we have said is we will be competitive, but we will be competitive within the framework of those 4 simple fares. All we did today, to be quite candid, is we moved those fares, that structure down, so as to match TWA's fares. So we're not trying to put anybody out of business. We are trying to be competitive. It is essential that we be competitive.
Mr. Levine reminds us that you've said in the past that there need to be fewer airlines, and you think 3 would be the ideal. Do you still think that?
No, and I think Mr. Levine misquotes me just a bit. In various forums where people have asked about the structure of the airline business, I've made the point that as the number of airlines, the number of major airlines in this country has decreased, the intensity of competition has increased. Very interesting statistic that as airlines become more national in scope and open more hubs, the number of competitors on each origin and destination market has actually increased. So I have simply observed that in an unregulated, a deregulated airline industry, I think the number of carriers will devolve towards some smaller number. That may be 4 or 5 or 6. I frankly doubt that it will ever get down to 3.
Do you think this revolution you've introduced is going to hasten that process, as Mr. Levine does? It's turned up the heat on the process.
Well, I don't think so. Now, obviously, each carrier has to make their own decisions. But as you look at the economics of the value pricing plan, the most severe adverse impact will fall first on carriers like my own. We've carried a fair percentage of full fare customers in the past, and those people, of course, will get a very substantial 38% discount, sometimes a larger discount. Some of the carriers have had fewer full fare passengers in the past. Thus, the immediate adverse impact on a carrier like American is going to be much larger than the immediate adverse impact on a carrier that has been had the patronage of fewer first-class passengers. By the same token, the increase in the size of the market should be good for every carrier. So we think, as I said earlier, this is good for consumers, and we think it is potentially good for every airline.
If there are going to be fewer airlines in the end, what has been gained by deregulation? A few big carriers dominating the skies?
Oh, I think not. If, for example, you look, come back to a point that I made a moment ago, as a number of carriers have developed a truly national scope, the number of competitors on origin and destination markets around the system has steadily increased. So I think that if you find in the end 4 or 5 or 6 carriers, all of whom are essentially national in scope, that consumers will find that on any origin and destination market they frequent, they will have multiple competitors. So I think what you've got is a system which by every measure, the Brookings Institute, for example, has estimated that deregulation has saved consumers something on the order of $10 billion a year in its first 10 years. Clearly a far more efficient system than that which was operated under the regulatory control of the government for many years up until the late 1970s.
Let's go back to Carl Icahn. Mr. Icahn, how important a turning point is this in the economics of the airline industry? Are we at the end of the process of deregulation now?
Yeah, I think we are. I think this is the turning point. But I'd like to add that, you know, Bob Crandall is saying that, you know, he's not doing it for the purpose of driving the airlines out. And when we started lowering fares, and we believe in lowered fares, we started in October 23rd. Bob Crandall told the Wall Street Journal when we lowered fares, the industry's unwillingness to price its products to cover fully allocated fares is a great problem. And then he told Travel Weekly, prices are too low and no material improvement in sight. Now, and he told the Journal of Commerce, things would be better if Continental shut down. So, you know, the real thing here, and again, I don't even blame Bob Crandall, but the mendacity here bothers me. I mean, the real reason is to try to clear this industry, and perhaps that's all right.
If you don't blame him, if you don't blame him, why is it mendacity? Would you be doing the same in his place, in his shoes?
Well, I have to tell you that, again, you know, we're not at a church social here. I don't know if I would take the risk that he's taking, because I think, you know, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars could be lost if he's wrong and doesn't drive the other airlines out of business, because it's a tremendously leveraged business. You know, the revenue here leverages this whole business, and it's a very interesting gamble, but that's what it is. I think it's a type of gamble I would rather make with my own money. It sounds ironic, but, you know, when you start with shareholders' money, you can face a tremendous tidal wave, and we're obfuscating the issue here. The issue is, can American drive us out of business? He is not going to drive TWA out of business, but whether he succeeds with the others is a fact that we have to see. And
is this a big gamble, Mr. Levine?
Oh, I think it's a gamble.
Could Americans stand to lose a lot on this?
No, I think it's actually a brilliant move, and Mr. Crandall is one of the brightest and most effective executives in the industry, but he's not running a charitable organization and shouldn't be allowed to present himself as though he is. What he's done is to make corporate discounting harder, because American sells most of its product through CRSs, through computer reservation systems, that it has a considerable advantage over some of its competitors in operating. What he's done is taken a situation where the worst case for him is that the fares come up on the table where American believes it can use its marketing clout to gain greater market share. And the best that happens is that a few of these stressed competitors go to the wall quickly, making it harder to organize the others into more effective competitors to American. The odd thing about this discussion is that everyone is sort of a little bit right, and that's kind of interesting. Plaskett's right. The fares do need to go up over time because the industry isn't making what it takes to keep it in business. Mr. Icahn is clearly right that the fact that pressure is going to be put on other airlines has not been lost on American Airlines. Mr. Crandall is clearly right. Deregulation has been good for the public. If we have as many as 5 or 6 big airlines left at the end of this process, I have no doubt that we will have a very competitive system. And it's true that there's more competition now than there ever has been before. It's what everyone kind of leaves out of this process, out of this discussion, that's the key here. The question is, what will happen if this process goes on a very rapid course, which Mr. Icahn is helping to contribute to by believing somehow that he can magically shelter himself from, in a niche, as he calls it, from price competition with an airline as big as TWA. If this process goes on the way it looks now, what will happen, I believe, is that the 3 Chapter 11 airlines will not survive it, and that when they go down, it will be much harder to reallocate their assets in a way that will allow the existence of a 4th or 5th strong competitor to American, United, and Delta.
Yeah. Mr. Plaskett, do you agree with Mr. Levine that's what's going to happen?
Well, I think I would share Mike's view that there's a little bit of truth and accuracy in what everyone has said. I think the thing we are missing here is that fare simplification was needed and was necessary. What has happened with the subsequent pricing moves is that we have started down a spiral, which will result in very large cash losses if it continues. If it doesn't continue and things stabilize, perhaps the system will adjust. Other carriers will adjust their own pricing structures so that they can be assured of a revenue stream rather than wondering whether there's going to be enough to cover the postage.
What will stabilize it if Mr. ICAHN can now, as he said a moment ago, study these new fares and undercut them? What will stabilize the market?
Well, I think it's going to have to be a rational application of the laws of economics and find out that pretty soon you're not going to have sufficient revenues to cover your cash costs. And not even a carrier in Chapter 11 has the luxury of infinite cash resources. None of these airlines do. And I'm concerned about the spiral. I am not concerned about the concept of the fare structure that was originally introduced. I think, as Mike said, it was a brilliant move. I think it was needed. I think the public has responded, perhaps not understanding what the ultimate goal of the structure was. But I think there is room for concern now about the rate of escalating the depth of the cuts.
Mr. ICAHN, to use Mr. Levine's phrase, how can you magically shelter yourself? I mean, if you're going to undercut, as you just heard Mr. Plaskett say, you're going to reach a point where you can't cover costs.
Well, I really think that what Mr. Levine is missing here is that there is another way to look at this. What we've done with the business saver fares and we did with the leisure saver fares, we made an awfully lot of money in the last few months from the business saver fare going from the hub citadel cities through St. Louis. In other words, we offer an alternative to the business flyer, a different product. We say to the business flyer, if you want to fly through St. Louis, it's a different product and you can pay a lot less. Eventually, we think we can compete with that. We think we can do that with the leisure flyer. I think there's a niche here for a different type of alternative. I also disagree with Mr. Levine on another thing. I think that even if they do put airlines out of business, you can't do away with the capacity that's on the Mojave Desert. I really think there will be a proliferation of a new type of an airline that does something like I'm talking about, that offers alternatives. You see, the big giants are, to me, a little bit like dinosaurs. They are not cost competitive. They do not have the economics of scale. They have cash. But, you know, so do these big real estate companies have cash 2 years ago. But the assets that you have are only as good as what you can do with them. These big buildings you can't rent.
I have to go back to Mr. Crandall here because we're just in the last minute. Mr. Crandall, are you in danger of becoming a big dinosaur because your cost structure is so much higher than Mr. ICAHN's? And well, you heard what he said.
Well,
and also, Mr. Levine said there is Mr. ICAHN also said you're taking a very big risk with your shareholders.
Well, I think a couple of summary statements might be helpful. For example, for the 12 months ended December 31st of last year, our costs were just a trifle less than TWA's despite their bankruptcy. I think the key issue here is value. We have delivered a product that our customers said they wanted. They said they wanted flexibility and simplicity. They said they wanted value back in airfares. We've tried to put it there. It's a much simpler structure. We will save ourselves some costs in administering that structure. We think we have created something that is good for consumers, and we think we have created a structure within which all carriers can prosper. And I'd sum up, I guess, by saying if you look at the history of business, not just the airline business, but all business, anybody who tries to run his own or her own business by putting his or her competitor out of business has been pretty unsuccessful. We're trying to bring value to the consumer, not put anybody out of business.
How do you respond to Mr. Plaskett's anxiety about the pace of the spiral? When do you think that spiral down will bottom out, will consolidate and stabilize?
I think Tom put it pretty well in pointing out that we're all a different group of competitors. Each airline knows that it must be competitive, and therefore airlines typically match the fares offered by other airlines. So those who are leading the spiral downward will presumably eventually reach the conclusion that lowering fares still further makes no economic sense.
Well, Mr. Crandall, Mr. ICAHN, Mr. Levine, and Mr. Plaskett, thank you all for joining us.
Now, a report from Russia. One more story among thousands of the transition from communism. The CBC Journal program visited Gorky, a city only recently opened to foreigners. In the communist era, it had been best known as the place where Andrei Sakharov was exiled for his human rights activism. Gorky now has a new name, but as correspondent Elizabeth Palmer reports, it also has many problems.
The great Russian writer Maxim Gorky was born here, but he never wanted the city's name changed to honor him. That was Lenin's idea. So Gorky would be glad to know the name's been changed back to Nizhny Novgorod. For centuries, it was a rich port where merchants built mansions and monuments with profits from the Volga River trade. Nizhny's glory days are history now. It's a little down at heel. You don't see traders and sailors on the streets, but factory workers, many of them going to work in the defense industry. Nizhny has been a focal point for the great Soviet military complex. There are 50 defense plants operating here, which employ about half the workforce.
Because of the defense connection, the city was also completely closed for years. In fact, it wasn't even on some maps. Well, today it's wide open to anybody who wants to visit, including foreigners. And this newly opened city has a brand new Democratic governor. But in an ironic twist, he wasn't elected, he was appointed.
Boris Nemtsov is 32 years old. He was elected to the Russian parliament 2 years ago, and then last November, Boris Yeltsin appointed him governor. Giving out candy to kids in hospital, Russian TV in tow, may look like the tackiest kind of politicking. But Nemtsov is just learning Western-style PR. And to be fair, there was nothing but candy to give. Then there's a hitch in the governor's tour. With no watchful aides to protect him, the head doctor traps Nemtsov and tells him off. There's no money to finish the hospital's new wing, and she's getting the runaround from his bureaucrats. It's not only PR aides that Nemtsov needs. It's experienced managers who can push through economic changes which are bound to make conditions worse in the short run. They're a rare breed in Russia, and so far he's only got half as many as he needs.
I
started to hire people who are close to me, not only in the political sense, but also in their understanding of the present situation in general. People who are competent, and I think responsible enough. The formation of the team has begun, but we have had very little time to finish this process.
The governor's job comes with perks like the ex-party limousine.
Policeman on the road.
But this governor isn't casual about the trappings of power yet. He's worried about getting speeding tickets because Boris the Democrat insists on driving himself while his chauffeur sits in the back seat. They're on their way to an unfinished nuclear plant on the outskirts of Nizhny. This is one of the triumphs of Russia's environmental movement. Activists forced construction to stop in the mid-'80s, warning it could be another Chernobyl, and Boris Nemtsov was in the vanguard of the fight. Back then, as a young physics student, he saw it as a victory. Now it's just a political headache. Nizhny Novgorod is running out of energy. This plant could help, but powering it up with nuclear fuel is out of the question. Boris and his advisor, Yevgeny Gorkov, have to find a better idea.
Да, завезли его уже давно, но...
Maybe use natural gas as fuel.
Любых целей, кроме производства.
But where to find the money for that kind of conversion? Nemtsov sees salvation in local capitalism.
Мне представляется, что инвестиции...
It seems to me that investments in our country should begin with local money. Creative, entrepreneurial people should be able to take out business loans from banks, the same way people do in the West. And the companies which are on the verge of collapse should change their forms of ownership fast.
Like Nizhny's defense plants. 4 years ago, the Ulyanov factory supplied electronics to the Navy. Nowadays, the Navy's not buying anything. So the company is trying to switch to making bread ovens and consumer appliances. But what capitalist would invest in a factory like this? It's a working industrial museum. Even the shine on the kettles goes on by hand. Legions of underpaid workers grind out old-fashioned appliances on ancient machinery. And even if an investor was willing to modernize this plant, there would be fallout. Massive unemployment as technology threw these workers out of their jobs. Workers who are already angry as their standard of living continues to fall.
Nothing. We have nothing. The bosses only bring supplies for themselves. For the workers, they bring nothing. Over the holidays, they had salmon, and we didn't have anything. Absolutely nothing. The managers think only of themselves, the bastards. We have to take care of our own needs.
To keep the lid on serious unrest, the Ulyanov factory lets its workers buy bread and some meat in the lobby as they come off shift. But that doesn't help the hundreds of Nizhny's people who are stuck with lining up in the cold every day. What will put enough food back on the shelves for them? Over in the governor's office, Boris Nemtsov has a radical plan. But it's a tough sell to these old bureaucrats. Nemtsov wants a completely deregulated system, absolutely no price subsidies, but a social welfare net for the poor. He doesn't have many allies at the table. Until last fall, this man was in charge of keeping subsidies on food. Today, he has to take them off. The mayor supports Nemtsov. But this man, a former KGB officer, is skeptical. Already, Nemtsov's plan is bogging down in conflicting loyalties.
I can foresee a lot of political opposition saying that, this guy is Yeltsin's nominee, that he doesn't have connection, that he doesn't have qualification, that he's an outsider, and I couldn't even exclude a prospect of bureaucratic sabotage or attempts to mislead and to fool this guy because they have their own system of doing things, and some of our bureaucrats are very tricky, are very experienced in fooling their superiors.
Nemtsov insists he has things under control. He fired everyone as soon as he arrived and only hired them back on trial.
There
is no democracy in appointing senior administration personnel. Everybody, except the mayor, is appointed by me, and I can dismiss them. All staff work on year-long contracts with 3 months probation. If the employee doesn't perform, he or she will be dismissed. I think this will allow us to avoid what you're talking about, the tough resistance of the old staff.
Reform may have arrived in the governor's office, but the shake-up there doesn't show on the streets. Life looks and feels pretty much the same. If anything, it's a little harder. There's less food, more uncertainty, and no money to erase the old monuments to communism. For the first time in 60 years, a Nizhny government leader is in church. Looking a little uneasy right up at the front. Boris Nemtsov has never been a practicing Christian. But as a practicing politician, he knows it's expedient to make peace and a good impression on all his constituents. He's willing to lend his support to the faithful and can only hope that in return they'll have patience with him. But there's no guarantee.
I think that he would be extremely successful if he manages to keep the power for a year already.
Why do you see it as such a fragile thing?
Well, because the social costs will be immense, because the trend towards disintegration of Russia will be gaining momentum, and because even within the Russian leadership, we still have a lot of conflicting views, and we have a lot of conflicting signals coming out of the administration.
For the people of Nizhny Novgorod, life now is a waiting game. They've opened up their city to visitors, investment, and democracy. But so far, the rewards have been scant. Scarce food, rising prices, looming unemployment. Boris Nemtsov's job is to deliver better than that, if he's to emerge the hero of reform, not the scapegoat of disintegration.
Finally tonight, an essay about the First Ladies of America. The essayist is Los Angeles writer Ann Taylor Fleming.
There she stood, Barbara Bush, in all her radiantly unapologetic grandmotherliness, exhorting the Wellesley grads of 1990 to spend more time with their families and friends, and telling them that human connections over the long haul of a life were much more important than a job. There had been controversy aplenty about her selection as speaker. Some students said that she was only asked because of whom she was married to, not because of what she'd done in her own right. But she came and spoke and seemingly conquered.
Who knows? Somewhere out in this audience may even be someone who will one day follow in my footsteps and preside over the White House as the president's spouse. And I wish him well.
2 decades earlier, at her own graduation from Wellesley, this woman spoke, Hillary Clinton, the impassioned personification of a new breed of women, those who were going to make their own way, speak their own minds, forge their own careers, carry their own briefcases. Now, as their husbands run for the presidency, Barbara Bush and Hillary Clinton meet in a kind of undeclared battle over the role of American women, the soul of American women, certainly over the role of the political wife. And in many ways, it is an arresting, even a poignant matchup. At first glance, they seem polar opposites, each one wearing her generation very much on her sleeve. There's Barbara Bush, a woman who dropped out of college to marry the man she loved, and then spent her life following him from job to job with children in tow. That role, that time. The station wagon mom who believes family comes first, who would never publicly contradict her husband's positions, even though she is allegedly more liberal than he on social issues. An unpretentious woman who feels the need neither to share power with her husband nor to camouflage her grandmotherly demeanor. No dye and diet jobs here. This is no Nancy Reagan. What you see is what you get. George's wife, Millie's mother, Raisa's pal, everybody's grandmother, everybody's something. And then there's Hillary Clinton, every bit a woman of her own time, feisty and attractive and opinionated, a woman who was first in her Yale Law School class and maintained her own career as a lawyer and advocate for children's issues while being both First Lady of Arkansas and a mom as well. She uses the we word when she's campaigning, as in, we're ready to run, and often introduces her husband with passionate political speeches of her own. Many women of my generation are watching her with sympathetic scrutiny, wanting her to give the very best account of who we are and where we came from, and what we mean to be, and the juggling act we mean to pull off. Sometimes she slips and lets us see all the tension underneath that act, as in this 60-minute soundbite about her husband's alleged infidelities.
You know, I'm not sitting here as some little woman standing by my man like Tammy Wynette.
Or this come back to haunt you quip about her role.
You know, I suppose I could have stayed home and baked cookies and had teas, but what I decided to do was to fulfill my profession, which I entered before my husband was in public life.
Hearing them, we wince, my peers and I. Not just for the women destined to feel denigrated by those quips, but for Hillary Clinton herself, for the fine line she has to walk, for the bargains she's indeed made. All we women have made. Hillary Clinton is the new woman in the old position, in the limelight, but still in the shadow of her husband, trying to be assertive and yet not upstage him at the same time. Old choices, new choices. Old conflicts, new conflicts. Old angers, new angers. Yet for all their differences, Barbara Bush and Hillary Clinton are not opposites. The poignance of the matchup, in fact, is in their similarities. They are role models tethered to ambitious men, women of generational grit and enduring, if sometimes self-silencing loyalties to those men. Both of them finally a bracing reminder of just how steep are the requirements of political life and love, and of how hard it still is to be your whole own person, your whole own woman in late 20th century America. I'm Ann Taylor Fleming.
Again, the major stories of this Monday. The Supreme Court agreed to consider placing new limits on the power of federal courts in overturning state criminal convictions. Rebels in Afghanistan surrounded the capital and demanded the surrender of the government. Deposed President Najibullah has reportedly fled to India. Good night, Jim.
Good night, Robin. We'll see you tomorrow night with a debate about the Canadian healthcare system, among other things. I'm Jim Lehrer. Thank you and good night.
Funding for the MacNeil Lehrer NewsHour has been provided by PepsiCo. Part of helping the world live and communicate better is keeping it well informed. That's why funding for the NewsHour is also provided by AT&T and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and viewers like you.
Videocassettes of the MacNeil Lehrer NewsHour are available from PBS Video. Call 1-800-328-PBS1. This is PBS.
Acquisition of this program was made possible by Friends of Iowa Public Television. And funding for the Iowa broadcast is provided by Luther College in Decorah, Iowa, since 1861, an environment for academic excellence. And by CRST, a family-owned company based in Iowa and a major truck carrier in the United States, which is proud to support the MacNeil Lehrer NewsHour.
You are viewing Iowa Public Television. Tonight, take a personal voyage of discovery to the Spice Islands, see computers enter the life of everyone, and explore varied treatment for mental illness.
You know, you don't give away tax dollars to cause unemployment. We're actually paying to have our own jobs moved, and it's a real tragedy.
You can't say, well, we can't subsidize them and we can't give them any tax breaks, but they can't leave. I mean, you
just make it neutral. They're not leaving for Puerto Rico because the weather is better down there. They're leaving because the taxes here are excessive.
They're leaving because there's an astonishing tax break.
Next on Listening to America, Part 2 of America, What Went Wrong.
Tune in to Iowa Public